I was out in the woods last summer, camping alone in a state forest about 2 hours from where I lived. I'd been doing solo camping trips for a couple of years by then, and I liked the peace of being by myself, especially in places where I didn't see other people for days. There was something about the quiet that helped me reset. I could sit there and just listen to the wind in the trees, the birds, the crunch of leaves under my boots. It made everything in life feel simpler. The place I picked this time wasn't on any official trail. I found it by looking at topographic maps online and spotting a small flat clearing next to a bend in a shallow creek. It wasn't far off an old Forest Service road, maybe a mile and a half in. I parked on the side of the road, locked my truck, and hiked in with my gear. It wasn't a long walk, but it was thick with undergrowth, and the trail was really just a path animals had worn into the trees. I had to duck under branches and step over fallen limbs the whole way in. When I finally reached the clearing, it was late afternoon. There was a small rise just above the creek where I set up my tent, a decent flat spot with good drainage in case it rained. The trees around the site were tall and spaced out just enough to let in a bit of light. The ground was soft but not marshy. I dropped my pack and got to work, pitched the tent, laid out my sleeping pad and bag, hung my food bag in a tree, and started gathering wood for a fire. I wasn't planning on staying more than a night or two, so I didn't overdo it. Just enough for an evening fire to cook on and keep warm. After I got everything settled, I boiled some water, made myself a dehydrated meal, and sat by the fire while the sky dimmed. It was one of those perfect evenings. No bugs, no wind, just cool, dry air and the sound of the creek down below. I didn't bring much with me that trip. A small book, a flashlight, a knife, a weather radio. I left my phone off because I knew there wouldn't be service out there anyway. I had no plans other than to just sit and breathe. Around sunset, I heard some rustling up the hill behind my camp. I stopped what I was doing and listened. At first, I thought it was a deer. It was slow and heavy, moving through the brush, but not crashing through it. I stood up, quietly, and looked uphill, but I couldn't see anything through the trees. Whatever it was didn't make another sound. I figured it had caught my scent or seen my fire and wandered off. I wasn't too worried. Animals usually avoid people. After it got dark, I stayed up for a while by the fire. The stars came out and the sky was clear. I could hear owls in the distance and the soft movement of the creek nearby. I ended up dozing off sitting up, my back against a log, legs stretched out toward the fire. I probably sat like that for an hour or more before waking up, stiff and cold. I tossed a few more sticks on the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped myself in for the night. That night, I woke up again, not from cold or discomfort, but because I had that prickling feeling you get when you know someone's watching you. I opened my eyes and waited, breathing slow. The fire had burned down to nothing but glowing coals, casting just enough light to see the outline of the tent's walls. I didn't move at first. I just listened. There was no sound, no wind, no animals, not even the creek. It was dead silent. That was what felt so strange, the total absence of sound. Even in the woods, that kind of quiet doesn't happen unless something's wrong. Then I heard something small and sharp. Click, came from just outside the tent, maybe 3 feet away from where my head was. A single, hard tap on something plastic or metal. Then again, click, click. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't make deliberate tapping noises like that. And it wasn't random. It had a rhythm like someone trying to figure something out. I held my breath, heart hammering, and reached slowly for my knife, which I always kept inside my sleeping bag with me. I didn't move the zipper or rustle anything, just inched my hand toward the hilt. Click, click, then a scrape, soft but steady, like something was dragged across the nylon of the tent wall. I could see the shadow now, a small shape pressed close to the wall, too small to be a person, too smooth to be an animal. It moved slow around the tent toward the foot, then stopped again. I didn't move. I just gripped the knife and waited. After a minute or so, the sound stopped. I kept waiting. Nothing. Eventually, I dozed off again, knife still in my hand. In the morning, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. Nothing was disturbed. No boot prints, no trash dragged out. No signs of anything large moving through. But about 6 feet from the tent, near the edge of the fire ring, I saw something strange. Plastic lid. The kind that snaps onto a medicine bottle. It was just sitting there on top of the dirt. I hadn't brought anything like that with me. I don't take any medications and I pack light, just what I need. But there it was, clean and white, like it had just come from a pharmacy. I picked it up and turned it over. On the inside, someone had scratched something. It was faint, probably done with a knife or sharp stone, and hard to read at first. I had to hold it close to the fire to make it out. LOL. That's all it said. Just LOL. I felt cold all over. I dropped the lid and looked around again, turning in a slow circle. The forest was silent. Too silent.
No birds. No squirrels.
Nothing. I walked around the edge of camp looking for more signs. More trash. Something left behind. But I didn't find anything else. It was like someone had stepped into my camp, left that lid, and vanished. I packed up my gear fast. Didn't even cook breakfast. I stuffed everything into my bag, put out the fire, and started hiking back toward the truck. My head was on a swivel the whole way. Every snap of a twig or brush of leaves made me turn around. But I didn't see anyone. No one followed me. When I got back to the truck, I tossed my gear into the bed and locked the doors behind me as fast as I could. I sat there for a few minutes before starting the engine, just breathing, trying to make sense of it. Could have been a joke. Some other hiker messing around. But the thing is, I hadn't seen a single person out there. No tire tracks on the service road. No boot prints near camp. No voices, nothing. And the way that lid was scratched, it wasn't fresh. It looked old, worn down, like someone had been carrying it around for a while. On the drive back, I kept running through possibilities. Maybe someone had camped there before and left it behind, and an animal dragged it into my camp. But how did it end up so perfectly placed? Why just that, and why those 3 letters? When I got home, I unpacked my gear and found something else. Inside one of the outside pockets of my pack, tucked into the mesh, was a folded piece of paper. I hadn't put it there. It wasn't there when I packed. I pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. It was torn from a spiral notebook. Faint blue lines, one corner ripped. On it, written in pencil. LMAO, it took me some seconds to get it. Good one. No name, no other message. Just that. I didn't laugh. It didn't feel like a joke. It felt like someone had been watching me. Someone who wanted me to know they'd been right there, close enough to touch my stuff, close enough to hear me breathe. Someone who didn't care that I was alone, in the middle of nowhere. I've camped a lot over the years and I've had weird stuff happen. Animals sniffing around my tent, people hiking by at night, odd sounds I couldn't explain. But nothing like that. Nothing that made me feel like someone had crawled inside my trip, watched me while I slept, touched my gear, left me a message just vague enough to make me doubt my own memory. I haven't gone camping alone since. Not because I'm scared of the woods, but because I don't know if I'll ever feel alone out there again. Not really. I keep thinking about that night. The clicks, the scratching, the silence, and that plastic lid like a little joke only they understood. Maybe it was meant to be funny, maybe just a prank, but to me it felt like a warning, or a test, and I still don't know if I passed. I used to do a lot of solo camping in my 20s. I liked the silence. Being alone in the woods gave me a kind of peace that I couldn't find anywhere else. No traffic, no emails, no neighbors. Just me, my gear, and the forest. Most of the time, I would go to the Cascades or the Olympics, somewhere with maintained trails and marked campsites. But this time, I decided to try something different. It was late October. I had a 3-day weekend, and I picked a spot deep in the Idaho Panhandle, north of Priest Lake. I'd found it on a satellite map. Just a thick chunk of forest that looked like it hadn't been touched in a long time. There was a fire road that ran nearby and some scattered game trails, but nothing official. That's what appealed to me. I parked my truck in a small dirt clearing just past a gated logging road, threw on my pack, and started hiking. The air was cool and dry, leaves already brown and brittle on the forest floor. I followed the fire road for about a mile, then turned off into the brush using my compass and some landmarks I'd mapped out. I was aiming for a ridge about 4 miles in, where I'd seen a flat patch near the treeline. The hike wasn't easy. No trails, just rough terrain, uneven ground, thick undergrowth, loose soil. Took longer than I expected. I stopped twice to rest and check my bearings. The trees were packed tight in some places, making it hard to tell how far I'd gone. Still, I pressed on. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was low. I found the clearing I was looking for, maybe 30 feet wide, surrounded by dense fir and pine. One side dropped off into a slope, giving me a partial view of the forest below. Felt remote, isolated, exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent, gathered some deadfall, and got a small fire going. I cooked a freeze-dried meal, sat by the flames, and watched the light fade behind the trees. No animals, no planes, no voices. Just the wind through the branches and the occasional creak of the forest settling for the night. When it got cold enough, I climbed into my tent and zipped myself into my bag. I didn't bring any electronics with me. No phone, no music. Just a flashlight, a compass, and a journal I hardly ever wrote in. I lay there for a while, listening to the forest. Then I fell asleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a noise that woke me, more like a sensation, like the air pressure had changed. I listened. Everything was still, too still. Even in quiet woods, there's always something. Crickets, branches shifting, maybe an owl. But this was total silence. I sat up and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. The fire was just embers now. The sky was clouded over, and the woods around me looked darker than before. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I told myself it was nothing, just nerves, maybe the change in air temperature. I zipped the tent and lay back down. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't shut off. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it was all in my head. I ate breakfast and packed a small day bag to explore further up the ridge. There were some interesting rock formations I wanted to check out, and I thought a short hike might help reset my head. I hiked for maybe 2 hours. The slope was steep, and I had to climb over some fallen trees and navigate through patches of thick brush. Eventually, I reached a rock outcrop that gave me a wide view of the surrounding forest. From there, I could see my camp far below, just a tiny patch of canvas between the trees. That's when I noticed something strange. There were marks in the dirt beside me. Not footprints, more like drag marks. Parallel lines carved into the soil, about shoulder width apart, running from the edge of the rocks back into the trees, like something had been pulled or had slid downhill. I followed the marks for maybe 20 feet before they vanished into the underbrush. The ground was too disturbed to make out any pattern beyond that. I stood there for a few minutes looking around. Still no sounds. Still no animals. On the way back to camp, I noticed more signs. A tree with bark stripped away, clawed down to the pale wood beneath. Broken branches that looked fresh. A strange smell, like rot or old blood, hanging in the air for a few steps, then gone. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already dropping low again. I skipped dinner and just sat by the fire. I didn't want to think too hard about what I'd seen. Could have been anything. An old bear, maybe. A cougar dragging a kill. Even though the marks were fresh, I tried to convince myself they were old. When it got dark, I sat with my back to a tree and kept the fire going. I wasn't going to sleep that night, not really. I had my headlamp on low, my knife in my hand, just waiting. Then I heard it. Not a roar, not footsteps, just a soft rustling, far off in the brush. Then nothing. Then again closer. Pause. Then another movement, always followed by stillness. I scanned the darkness but couldn't see anything. My fire was low, and the trees were too thick. I stood up slowly, trying to pinpoint the direction, but the sounds seemed to come from different angles each time. It was like something was circling me. The rustling stopped for a long while. Then, without warning, I heard something heavy hit the dirt not more than 10 feet from my tent. A solid thump like a sack of wet sand. I jumped back and grabbed my light. I aimed it where the sound had come from and saw nothing. Just the forest. But when I stepped closer, I saw drag marks again. 2 parallel grooves cutting through the pine needles, stopping right where my tent was. That was enough. I didn't care what time it was. I packed up as quickly as I could, jammed my gear into my pack, tore down the tent without folding it. I didn't even put out the fire properly, just stomped the edges and poured my drinking water on it. I started hiking out with the flashlight on full, trying to retrace my path down the ridge. About a mile in, I found something else. It was a glove, one of mine. I recognized the brand and the hole in the thumb, but I hadn't dropped it. I was sure. I packed everything. This glove was laid carefully on a rock, right at chest height, like someone had placed it there. Another half mile and I saw more of my gear. My plastic cup, my spare socks, even a packet of matches I'd brought. All laid out in the open, spaced perfectly apart, always at eye level. That's when it hit me. Someone had been in my camp. While I was asleep or while I was out, they'd gone through my stuff, taken random pieces, and placed them in a line leading down the ridge. They wanted me to see it. It wasn't animals. It wasn't wind. It was deliberate. I kept moving. My legs burned. My heart was pounding. I stopped checking the GPS or compass. I just aimed downhill, toward the fire road, toward the truck. The forest got denser the lower I went, and the light from my headlamp only reached so far. Then I heard breathing. Not mine, not close, but deep, rhythmic, coming from the trees to my left. It was just a few beats and then it stopped. I didn't look. I just ran. Branches scratched my arms and face. My pack snagged on something and I let it rip. I stumbled more than once, but I kept moving. When I finally broke through the last patch of trees and saw the outline of my truck, I didn't feel relief, just dread. Because the driver's door was open. I hadn't left it open. I approached slowly. I checked the inside. Nothing seemed disturbed. The keys were still in the glove box where I'd hidden them. But the door being open meant someone had been here. I started the engine and drove out without closing the tailgate. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I drove all the way home that night. 6 hours, no music, no stops. I just kept the windows rolled up and my eyes on the road. I filed a report a week later, but there was no evidence. No crime, nothing taken. The ranger at the local station said maybe it was hunters messing with me, or my imagination, or a bear. But he didn't write anything down. That was 2 years ago. I haven't camped since. I still think about those drag marks. The gear laid out so neatly, the glove, the breathing. But the part one think about most is the fact that someone had to follow me all the way up the ridge. Had to watch me set up, wait until I left or fell asleep, and then walked into my camp. Calm, quiet, and completely in control. That's what sticks with me. Whoever they were, they weren't in a rush. They had time. Time to go through my stuff, to choose what to take, where to place it, how to leave the trail for me to find. And if they had wanted to hurt me, they could have. They didn't. They just wanted me to know they were there. That's worse. That's why I never went back. I moved to the US in my late 20s for work, leaving Spain behind for the first time in my life. I had studied English in school, but speaking it out loud in daily life was different. I got by, but sometimes I had to stop people and ask them to repeat themselves. Still, people were patient. They smiled and helped when I didn't understand something. I worked for a small software company in a quiet town in Oregon. It rained a lot, but I liked the trees. I was used to open hills and old buildings back home, so the endless green and mountains here felt like something from a movie. I started hiking more, especially on weekends. The silence of the woods helped me think. One day at work, someone mentioned a small lake hidden deep in a forest about 2 hours away. It wasn't part of a state park, just wild land. I looked it up, found the GPS coordinates, and checked satellite images. No marked trails, no cabins nearby, just trees and water. That was perfect. I planned a short solo camping trip for the following weekend. I packed light tent, sleeping bag, simple food, and a small radio that played weather updates. I took a knife, a flashlight, and a map I printed from the computer. I didn't bring my phone because I knew there would be no signal. I left early on a Saturday morning, driving through fog and back roads. The air was damp and cool. I reached the edge of the woods, parked my car behind some bushes, and locked it. From there, I walked west through the trees, following the compass toward the lake. It was supposed to be 5 miles in, but the land wasn't flat. I had to climb small hills, step over logs, and fight through wet ferns. After a few hours, I found it. The lake wasn't big, maybe the size of a football field. It was perfectly round and still, with tall pines all around. I didn't see a single sign of people. No footprints, no garbage. It was so quiet it made my ears feel like they were ringing. I picked a spot close to the shore and pitched my tent. I ate lunch on a flat rock while watching the water. There were no birds, no bugs. The only sound was the soft splash of a small fish breaking the surface. I sat there for a long time just watching the trees. Later, I gathered some sticks and built a small fire. I didn't need it for warmth, but the light made me feel less alone. I boiled some water, made a dry meal, and ate slowly as the sky darkened. The fire crackled softly. The forest stayed still. When night came, I turned off my flashlight and climbed into the tent. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. Nothing, not even wind. I started to feel uneasy. It was too quiet. In Spain, even the remote trails had crickets or owls. But here, it was like the whole world had shut off. I eventually fell asleep. I don't remember my dreams, but I woke up in the middle of the night for no clear reason. I opened my eyes and stayed still. I didn't hear anything at first. Then, slowly, I picked up on a sound. A soft crunch, like something stepping on pine needles. It wasn't fast, just one slow step, then another, then silence. I held my breath. My heart thumped. I waited. Another crunch, then nothing. It stopped. I didn't move. I stayed still for what felt like hours. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep because I opened my eyes to soft light. Morning. When I stepped outside, the fire pit was cold. The ground around my tent looked untouched. I felt silly. Maybe it was an animal. But then I saw something. About 10 feet from my tent, there was a stick standing straight up in the soil. I didn't do that. Tied to the stick with a rubber band was a small, folded paper. I slowly walked over, untied it, and opened the fold. It read, "As a Spanish guy who doesn't speak English perfectly, could someone give me an explanation of the end of this story?" My blood ran cold. It was my sentence. I remembered writing that online weeks ago. It was under a horror story post someone shared. The ending confused me because it used wordplay, and I didn't get the joke. I thought it was about language, so I left that exact comment. I even remember where I typed it, in my apartment on a rainy night. I stood there, reading it again and again. This wasn't random. Someone had been to my camp. While I slept, someone who had read my comment, found it interesting enough to copy, then printed it or wrote it by hand, and left it out here in front of me. Someone who knew I would understand it. Someone who knew I would be here. I packed up fast. I threw everything in my backpack and didn't eat. I took only minutes to put out the fire and shoulder my gear. Then I started walking back toward my car. Every few minutes, I looked over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone. No movement. No sounds. But the woods felt different now, less peaceful. More alive, like something watched from between the trees. I reached the car around midday. Everything looked fine. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I was back in town. I went inside my apartment, closed all the curtains, and sat on the couch. I took out the folded paper again. I couldn't make sense of it. It had no threats, no scary symbols. Just a sentence I once wrote. But that made it worse. It was personal. The next day, I checked my backpack again to make sure I didn't forget anything. That's when I found the second paper. It was inside the small inner pocket of my sleeping bag sack. Another folded piece about the size of a matchbox. I unfolded it with shaking hands. It said, "I think it's a language joke, but I don't get it at all." Another sentence I remember typing. It was from the same day as the first one, replying to someone who explained the story to me. I had been confused. I'd written that to say I still didn't get it. Now it was here, folded, hidden in my gear. This time, I sat down and stared at the wall. Someone had read what I wrote weeks ago, printed or copied it, followed me out into the woods, got into my gear while I was asleep, and left these notes. For what? A joke? A message? I didn't understand. That week, I stopped going out. I kept thinking about it, over and over. How did they know? How did they find me? I had never shared my name on that website. I never posted where I lived. I didn't use a photo. My screen name wasn't connected to my real name at all. Was it someone from work? Someone who followed me? Someone who knew I liked to camp alone? I stopped sleeping well. I kept thinking I heard steps outside my window. I closed all the blinds every night, double-locked the doors. But I never saw anything. Nothing obvious. Nothing clear. After 2 weeks, I took the notes, folded them again, and shoved them deep in the bottom drawer of my desk. I stopped hiking. I stopped going to the woods. I made excuses to my coworkers when they asked why I stayed inside more. Months passed. Then one day in spring, I got home from work, took off my shoes, and went to wash my hands. On the sink was a folded piece of paper. I stared at it without touching it. My apartment had been locked. No broken windows, no signs of a break-in, but there it was, right on the edge of the sink. Picked it up and opened it. Could someone give me an explanation of the end of the story? That was all. The exact words. Again, that night I left. I packed what I needed and went to stay with someone from work. I didn't tell them why. I just said I had plumbing issues. But I knew. I knew I wasn't safe. Whoever it was, whatever they wanted, it wasn't over. This wasn't just some online joke. It wasn't random. They had chosen me. They knew things they weren't supposed to know. My words, my habits, my location. But the worst part was this. They never explained the joke. They never said what the story meant. Because I was the story, and I still don't get it. I still think about that summer like it just happened, even though it's been more than 15 years. The kind of memories that stay in the back of your head, never fully fading. Some nights, when I can't sleep and the house is quiet, I swear I can still feel the cold pressure of that fear, the weight of being watched from the dark woods. It happened when I was 15, during a week-long scout camp at Pico Blanco, tucked deep in the Santa Lucia Mountains. I'd been to other camps before, but Pico Blanco felt different from the moment we pulled off the winding highway and drove down the gravel road toward the reservation. It was my second year as a scout, and this trip was one I'd looked forward to for months. We were camping with 3 other troops, and I was with 6 guys from my unit, including my older cousin Derek, who was our patrol leader. Our campsite was called Bobcat Ridge, a shaded stretch of land bordered by tall pines and sloped rocky terrain. Everything smelled of red dust, dry pine needles, and campfire smoke. The days were packed with merit badge classes, hikes, and swimming in the Little Sur River, which cut cold and shallow through the middle of the valley. But nights, that's where the tone shifted. Nights at Pico Blanco had a heaviness to them. The wind made strange sounds moving through the trees, and the stars above were so sharp and clear it felt like you were looking at a painting. But even with all that beauty, there was something else out there. Something you didn't see, only felt. I'd heard the name before we even left for camp. The Dark Watchers. Derek had mentioned it when we were packing gear back home, but he brushed it off like it was some local myth. Just shadows on the ridgeline, he said. Old stories. Nothing real. But it stuck with me. The name alone had weight, and once we got to camp, I realized every scout who had been there before had heard about them too. There wasn't a real story behind them, no actual event or sighting people could point to. Just a consistent sense that when you were alone, or even with a group, and the sun started to drop behind the ridge, the woods changed. You'd feel like someone was watching you from the brush, from between the trees. It wasn't always visible, but the presence was there. Subtle but real. The staff even joked about it during the opening campfire. Don't get caught out alone after dark, one of the counselors said with a grin. The Watchers don't like it. Everyone laughed, but I noticed how none of the staff ever actually walked alone at night. They always moved in pairs or groups, even if they didn't say why. It wasn't until the 3rd night that I really started to understand what they meant. We had been at the archery range all afternoon and lost track of time. The sun had already dipped below the ridgeline when we started walking back toward camp. The trail was narrow and weaved between thick manzanita and Monterey pines. We were about half a mile out when the air got cooler and still. The sounds of the camp, distant laughter, clanging pots, shouts from the river, disappeared behind the hillside. Derek was leading and I was second behind him. The rest of our group followed in a staggered line. No one was talking anymore. The mood shifted. It wasn't anything anyone said. We all just felt it at the same time. That creeping silence. The kind that made you stop and look over your shoulder for no good reason. That's when it started. I don't know how else to say it. There were shapes in the trees, still tall and dark. At first, I thought it was just trunks or large boulders. But something was off. The way they were positioned. The way they didn't move, even though the wind was rustling the branches. We passed one set of trees where I swear I saw a figure, just a little taller than a man, standing completely motionless about 20 feet off the trail. No face, no details, just dark. I blinked and it was gone, or maybe it had never been there at all. I didn't say anything, neither did Derek. But I know he saw something too, because he picked up the pace and didn't look back. As we continued, I started to notice more of them, along the trail behind fallen logs near the large boulders, always just at the edge of visibility, never moving, but they were there. Not people, not animals, just shadows in the shapes of figures, blending with the trees. Watching, that's what it felt like. Watching, never approaching, never making a sound. One of the guys in the back tripped and swore under his breath, and the sound was so sudden it made us all jump. We didn't stop. We just kept going, faster now, nearly jogging. The trail curved around a rocky slope and then dipped into a narrow gully before rising again toward our campsite. That gully felt like a trap. Trees leaned over it, dense and close. I was sweating not from the hike, but from the fear. I refused to look back. I just stared at Derek's backpack in front of me and kept my feet moving. I don't know how long it took, but we finally made it to the edge of our campsite. As soon as I saw the flickering light of our campfire, I felt the tension break, just a little. I turned around then, just once, and I saw it again. On the ridgeline above, silhouetted against the faint light from the stars, was a figure, just standing there. No movement, no detail, just there. I blinked, and it was gone. We didn't talk about it that night. Nobody said anything while we made dinner or sat around the fire. It was like we all agreed not to mention it. But I could see it in their faces. Everyone had felt it. Everyone had seen something. You can't fake that kind of fear. The rest of the week, I stayed close to the main parts of camp. I skipped a couple hikes, even though I didn't say why. I wasn't the only one. A few other guys stuck close to the mess hall and activity areas too. That feeling of being watched didn't go away completely, even during the day. It would hit you out of nowhere, usually when you wandered off a little too far from the group, or paused alone at the edge of a trail. That prickling sense on your neck, the chill down your back. One night, on the 5th day, I woke up to pee. It was probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no crickets, just stillness. I stepped out of the tent and walked toward the edge of the trees with my flashlight. I kept the beam low, just enough to see where I was going. As I stood there, I had that same feeling again, that unbearable pressure, like someone was watching from 10 feet away. I didn't shine the light toward the woods. I didn't want to see anything. I just finished and backed slowly toward my tent. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The last full day of camp, they made us do a solo hike challenge. It was supposed to be a rite of passage, something every scout did to show growth or whatever. You'd hike a short loop by yourself, about 1.5 miles, with landmarks to follow. Normally, I'd be fine with that, but after the past few nights, I didn't want to be alone out there. Nobody did. We drew names from a hat for the order. I got third. Derek went first. He came back pale, quiet. Didn't say anything to me before I left. I started the hike late in the afternoon. The sun was still above the mountains, but barely. The trail was narrow and ran alongside a steep drop-off on one side, with thick woods on the other. I walked fast. I didn't stop to take in the view or check the guide markers. I just followed the path. Halfway through, I felt it again, that eyes-on-you feeling. I didn't turn around at first. I just kept walking. But then I heard a sound, soft, like a footstep on dry needles. That broke me. I turned and scanned the woods with my eyes. Nothing, but I knew something was there. I could feel it in my chest. When I got back to camp, Derek pulled me aside. He didn't say much. Just, "You saw them too, right?" That's all. I nodded. That was enough. We left Pico Blanco the next morning. The drive out felt long and tense. Everyone was quiet. No songs, no games, just the sound of tires on gravel and the occasional bird. As the woods thinned and the highway came into view, it felt like a weight lifted. I don't think I've ever been more relieved to see a strip of asphalt in my life. I haven't been back to Pico Blanco since. A few years later, I heard they had to shut parts of the camp down for maintenance after a big storm. Some trails were closed off due to rock slides. But I wonder sometimes if they just didn't want more kids going out there alone. Scouts still tell stories about the Dark Watchers. They laugh about it, treat it like just another scary campfire tale. But I know better. I didn't see ghosts. I didn't hear voices. I just felt it, deep in my gut, that we were being watched, followed, studied. And the worst part, whatever was out there, it never made a sound. It never came closer. It didn't need to. It just stood there, quiet and still, like it had all the time in the world. Like it had been there long before us, and would be there long after. It wasn't fantasy. It wasn't some old legend. It was just something real. Something that didn't want to be seen, but wanted you to know it was there, just watching. And I don't think I'll ever forget that feeling. I used to love telling stories about the Dark Watchers. Back when I was younger, in my early 20s, I'd go camping and backpacking with friends in Big Sur or somewhere deep in the Santa Lucia Range every summer, usually 2 or 3 times a year. I'd wait until the fire was burning low, until we'd all eaten and the quiet had settled in. Then I'd lean forward and talk low, like I was letting them in on some secret. I'd tell them about the tall figures people swore they saw standing on ridges at twilight, never moving, never making a sound, just watching. I'd say they appeared most in the Santa Lucias, always high up, where no one could easily reach. Always when you were alone. Always just far enough away to make you question what you were looking at. I'd laugh when they looked around nervously, tell them I was just kidding. But I wasn't. I actually did hear about them growing up. A teacher had mentioned them once in passing in a California folklore class. Just a footnote, nothing deep. But it stuck with me. I started digging around, and that's when I found a bunch of stories, sightings going back decades, mostly vague but similar, all centered around this stretch of mountains along the coast. And the more I looked, the weirder it got. No photos, no videos, just accounts. And every time I asked locals, they just shrugged. Never heard of them. That was always the answer. Like the name had never reached them, or they just didn't want to talk about it. But it was never something I took seriously. Not really, until the trip in 2016. I was 26 at the time. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, and I was trying to push myself more that year. I'd been stressed out, working a job I didn't care about, and I needed space. Real space. No cell towers, no traffic. Just trees and sky and dirt. I had 4 days off, so I packed light and planned a route that would take me into the Santa Lucias from a less popular access point on the inland side. I parked my car near a fire road about 15 miles southeast of Big Sur and started hiking up into the higher elevations. The first day was nothing special. The trail was rough and not well maintained, but I'd expected that. I followed a dry riverbed for a while, crossed a couple old footbridges, and climbed through patches of oaks and chaparral until I found a small clearing just off the trail. I set up camp there, made a little fire, cooked some basic food, and lay back to watch the stars. The quiet was perfect. No people, no noise, just wind and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. The second day I pushed further west, aiming to make it to a higher ridge where I knew there was a saddle point with good views of the coast. The air was crisp up there, and everything smelled like sun-baked sage and pine needles. My pace was steady and I didn't rush. I stopped often to take in the view or drink water, and I moved carefully over loose stone near the exposed parts of the trail. I saw maybe one deer, a few hawks overhead, and some small prints on the trail that could have been from a bobcat. By late afternoon, I found a decent patch to set up again. It wasn't much, just a level patch of ground with enough space for my small tent and a cooking area, but it was quiet and a little hidden, tucked beside a group of twisted oaks. Behind it rose a slope of sandstone and scrub. I remember thinking I could see a distant glint of the Pacific if I looked hard enough between the trees. That night, I had a strange feeling. Not fear exactly, but a kind of alertness that didn't fade. Like I couldn't quite relax. I chalked it up to being alone, out there hours from anyone. That always puts a bit of tension in your chest. But it felt deeper, not like danger, just like I wasn't the only one out there. I didn't sleep much that night. My body felt heavy, but my mind wouldn't slow down. I kept hearing small movements outside the tent. Not footsteps, not animals. It was more like the kind of sound you get when something brushes against low branches or shifts slightly on gravel. But it always stopped when I sat up or unzipped the tent to look out. Nothing there, just the wind and the trees. The next morning, I made coffee, ate a cold breakfast, and tried to shake the feeling off. I packed up and moved again, heading higher. The trail narrowed as I climbed, and the trees thinned out. By late morning, I was hiking along a rocky ridge that curved west toward the ocean. On both sides, steep drops fell into thick canyons. I found a spot around midday and took a break. That's when I saw the first one. I'd been sitting on a boulder, legs dangling, chewing on a granola bar, when I noticed something standing across the canyon, on the opposite ridge. First, I thought it was a dead tree. It was dark, narrow, upright, but it was too clean of a shape, too vertical, like the outline of a tall person wearing a cloak or long jacket. It didn't move. It didn't sway with the wind. It just stood there. I stared at it for at least a full minute. No binoculars, so I squinted hard. But the details didn't get clearer. No face, no arms visible, just a tall shape on the ridgeline, maybe half a mile away. I turned away for a second to grab my water bottle, and when I looked back, it was gone. I sat still for a long time after that. That evening, I camped further up the ridge, just below the tree line. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt watched. Every sound stood out, every twig snap, every gust of wind through dry leaves. I didn't start a fire. I didn't want the light drawing attention. I just lay in my sleeping bag inside the tent and listened. At some point deep into the night, I heard movement again. This time it was closer, more deliberate, the kind of soft crunching you only hear when someone's trying not to make noise. I held my breath, passed by slowly, maybe 10 feet from the tent. I didn't move. I didn't dare unzip the flap. Whatever it was, it didn't stop. It just kept going, slowly, steadily, until the sound faded into the woods again. By morning, I was exhausted and sick of my own fear. I packed up fast and started hiking back down, skipping the last day of the trip. I needed to get out. The whole time, I kept checking over my shoulder. I felt stupid, like I was chasing shadows. But every now and then, I'd catch that shape again. Always up high, always still. A person-shaped shadow standing far off, just on the edge of what you could clearly see. By late afternoon, I reached the lower trail again. The heat had come back, and my clothes were sticking to me with sweat. The trail leveled out as I got close to where I'd parked. I was maybe 20 minutes from the road when I heard something ahead. Not behind this time. It was faint at first, a rustling, like someone moving through the brush parallel to me. I slowed. The sound stopped. I kept walking, faster this time, my heart racing. But the sound started again, closer, but still out of view. Whatever it was pacing me, moving just beyond the tree line to my right. Kept up with me for about 5 minutes before stopping completely. No crashing off into the distance. No clear sign of movement. Just gone. I made it to the car by early evening. I sat in the driver's seat with the door open, catching my breath, legs shaking. The whole drive back to town, I couldn't stop checking my mirrors. Even when I hit the highway, I felt like something was still there, following from just out of sight. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone, not for a while. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen shapes in the distance? That I'd heard something walking through the woods? That it might have been nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing? Eventually I told Derek, an old camping buddy of mine, just to get it off my chest. He laughed at first, but then got quiet. Told me he'd seen something similar in the same range a few years back. Tall shapes on ridgelines, always far off, never moving. No one believed him either. I've looked into it more since then. The Dark Watchers. Some say it's an optical illusion, tricks of the light during twilight, shadows cast by rocks or trees. Some say it's a hallucination brought on by altitude, exhaustion, or stress. Maybe that's all it is, but I still go hiking. I still camp, just not out there, not in those mountains. Something about that range, something about the way it makes you feel when you're alone up high just doesn't sit right. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in fairy tales or monsters in the dark, but I believe in what I felt out there. I believe that you don't always need a reason to be afraid. Sometimes your body knows something your brain doesn't want to admit. And sometimes, when you're out there, far from everything, you'll catch a glimpse of something on the ridge, tall, still, watching, and you'll know you're not alone. When I was a kid, there was one story that used to freak my little cousins out more than any other. It was the story of Mary Sue, the girl with the bow around her neck. The version we knew was a little different from the usual one. There wasn't anything about her head falling off or anything like that. We heard it more as a local cautionary tale, something you told around a campfire, not because it was full of ghosts or monsters, but because it just felt wrong. And the weird thing is, I think I actually met the woman that story was based on. It was back in the summer of 2009. I was 19 at the time. That was the year I did the long camping trip through parts of the northern Sierra Nevada range with a few other guys from my college hiking group. There were 4 of us, me, Brian, Jay, and Evan. We had a rough route planned that would take about 9 days. It wasn't anything official, just some scattered trails, logging roads, and bushwhacking across stretches that weren't even on most maps. We'd load up our packs, hike most of the day, set up camp near dusk, cook some food, and crash early. Rinse and repeat. On the 6th day, we hit a patch of dense forest we hadn't accounted for. It slowed us down way more than expected. We were off trail at that point, relying on compasses and topographic maps, and the trees were packed tight together. Tall pines, deadfall, and so much underbrush that moving 5 feet felt like digging your way through a wall. It was quiet too. No birds, just the sound of your own breath and the crack of branches as you pushed forward. We were running low on energy by late afternoon. The air was hot and heavy, and every one of us was scratched up from the brush. We'd started arguing about whether to keep pushing or stop early, and eventually we decided to call it a day. We found a small clearing near the base of a slope, flat enough for tents, with a dry stream bed nearby where we could sit and rest. That night, after we ate, we didn't bother with a fire. It was too hot and we were too tired. We just sat on our sleeping mats under the open sky. Someone brought up old campfire stories, and I mentioned the one about Mary Sue. It got a few laughs, especially the version where her head supposedly falls off when she unties the bow. But I told the version we grew up with, which was more subtle. No magic, just a woman who wore a bow her entire life, and no one ever figured out why. Even her husband. She died with it still around her neck. The others made jokes and shrugged it off, and we all eventually passed out. The next morning, I woke up early, way earlier than usual. The sky was just starting to lighten, that gray-blue color that tells you sunrise is close but not quite there. The air had that cold bite that comes right before dawn. I walked a little away from camp to take a leak and stretch my legs. That's when I saw smoke, thin, white smoke curling up through the trees a little ways downslope. Surprised me. We hadn't passed any cabins or ranger stations, and we hadn't seen a soul since day 3. I thought maybe it was an old homestead or seasonal logging camp. I followed the smoke. It took me down the slope, past a dry creek, through a patch of ferns and moss-covered rocks. Eventually, I saw a roof. an old wooden structure mostly hidden by trees. It looked like a small cottage or shack. I stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared. It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't look new either. The windows had lace curtains. There were wind chimes made of polished stones hanging from the eaves, and the smoke was coming from a metal chimney. I felt weird standing there, like I was intruding, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached slowly. No one came out. No dogs barked. I knocked gently on the side of the doorframe, just enough to make my presence known in case someone was home. Nothing. I waited another minute, then decided to walk around the perimeter. The cabin sat on a slight slope. There were flower beds, wildflowers mostly. Someone had clearly tended to them. On the back side of the house was a small shed and a rusted wheelbarrow. That's when I saw her. She was sitting on a wooden bench just a few yards from the shed. I hadn't noticed her at first because she was so still. She wore a long, loose dress, probably handmade, with a pale blue cardigan over her shoulders. Her gray hair was tied back in a bun, and around her neck, just like in the story, was a black ribbon. Not a thin strip either. It was wide, maybe 2 inches thick, tied into a neat bow at the front. I froze when I saw it. My breath caught. Felt like I had walked into a dream. She looked at me. Her eyes weren't frightened or surprised, just calm. I gave a nervous nod and backed away slowly, trying not to seem threatening. Then I turned and walked back to camp as fast as I could without running. I didn't say anything to the others. Not right away. What was I supposed to say? Hey guys, I just saw Mary Sue sitting behind a random cabin in the woods. We packed up and moved on that morning. But I couldn't get the image out of my head. The cabin, the smoke, the bow. That afternoon, I found a small local trailhead on the map. It wasn't far from our route, and I convinced the group to take a detour. My plan was to cut the trip short and get back to civilization early. I was done. Something about that place had gotten under my skin. 2 days later, we were back in town. While the others were grabbing food, I stopped by the ranger station to ask about the cabin. I described where we had been, roughly near a dry creek and a southern slope. The ranger gave me a strange look, then flipped through an old binder of property records. There used to be a homestead out there, he said finally. Old woman lived there most of her life, kept to herself. Don't think she ever married. Name was Merrill or Muriel something. Locals said she used to come to town once or twice a year for supplies. I asked if she still lived there. She passed away 5-6 years ago, he said. Place was boarded up after that. I didn't say anything, just nodded and left. But here's the thing, I know what I saw. The woman on the bench, the smoke from the chimney, the flowers in bloom. That place wasn't abandoned, and that woman looked alive. Later that fall, back home, I started digging. I went through old newspaper archives and local records. Eventually, I found her. Muriel Sorensen, born 1928, died 2003, never married, lived alone in the woods. And in one of the old grainy black and white photos, there she was, standing in front of her cabin with a basket in one hand. Around her neck was a wide black ribbon tied in a bow. I never told my cousins about that part. I kept telling them the same version of the story I always had. The silly, spooky one with the head falling off. But I never laughed at it again, because the real version, the quiet, strange, unexplainable truth was worse. There was a woman. She lived alone in the woods. She always wore a bow around her neck, and no one ever found out why. I don't remember the name of the book, but I know exactly where I used to keep it. Bottom shelf of the bookcase in my childhood bedroom, just to the left of the closet. It had a black cover with blood-red writing, and the pages were full of short horror stories. Not the kind with ghosts or vampires. The creepy real-life ones, the it-could-happen-to-you types. I must have read it 100 times growing up. I used to take it camping and read the stories aloud by flashlight to scare my friends. There was one story in that book that stuck with me more than any other. I don't remember the title, but I remember the feeling. It was about someone camping alone and realizing they weren't alone after all. Not ghosts, not a monster, just the slow, terrible realization that someone had been watching them for days without making themselves known. The idea haunted me, not because of what happened in the story, but because of what didn't happen, what was only hinted at. You never saw the person. You never heard them speak. You just slowly came to understand that someone was out there, just beyond the firelight, waiting, watching. That feeling stayed with me into adulthood, even after I forgot the name of the book. Years passed. I moved to another state, got a job, got a dog. Life moved on. But the weird part is that specific fear never really left me. Even now, I still get uncomfortable when I'm alone in the woods. I can't explain it. It's not that I think something will happen. It's just the feeling of being observed. I think that's why I kept camping alone. Part of me wanted to prove I wasn't afraid, that I was just remembering some silly story I read as a kid, that it was fiction. But a few years ago, something happened. Something I've never told anyone in full. It was the last time I ever camped alone. It was late September, and the weather had just started to turn. That perfect window where the bugs were mostly gone. The days were cool, and the nights weren't yet bitter cold. I had the week off and decided to head out to a small patch of forest near the state line, about 3 hours from where I lived. It wasn't a park, not official, just state-owned land with a few old trails from the 60s and some overgrown logging roads. I liked that kind of place. No crowds, no screaming kids, just peace and quiet. I parked my car near a rusted gate that blocked off the old service road, slung my pack on, and hiked in a few miles. The ground was still soft from rain earlier in the week, and the leaves had started to fall, damp and yellow underfoot. The trail was narrow, barely visible in places, but I downloaded an offline map. I followed it to a spot near a slow-moving creek and set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by fir and maple trees. Felt perfect. I pitched my tent, hung my food bag, started a small fire, and settled in. That first night, I read from an old paperback, ate beef jerky and dried fruit, and let the fire die down until I could only see the orange embers glowing like coals under a blanket. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the trees. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night with the urge to pee. The air in the tent was cold, and I didn't want to get out of the bag. But eventually I pulled on a hoodie and crawled out into the dark. The fire had gone out completely. The stars were barely visible through the canopy. I walked a few feet from the tent and did my business, yawning. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A soft sound, not far away, a crack, then a second one, like a footstep. I froze and stared into the trees. Nothing moved. It was dead quiet. Probably a deer, I told myself. Could have been a raccoon, something small. I stood there for another minute, waiting, but the noise didn't come again. I crawled back into the tent and zipped it shut, heart beating just a little harder than before. I didn't sleep well after that. In the morning, everything seemed normal. The woods looked peaceful in the daylight. The sun streamed through the trees and turned the leaves gold. Birds chirped. A squirrel darted past my tent. The paranoia from the night before felt silly. I boiled water for coffee and had a granola bar. Then I packed a small day bag and followed the trail further up the ridge. My plan was to do a 5 or 6 mile loop and get back before dusk. The trail was overgrown and hard to follow in places. Lots of fallen branches and brambles. I had to backtrack once after I realized I'd taken a wrong turn near a dried-up stream bed. But I found the ridge eventually and followed the loop around. It gave me a great view of the valley below. No signs of people anywhere, just trees stretching out for miles. About halfway back down, I started getting that feeling again. That same feeling from the story I loved as a kid. The one where the main character realizes they're not alone. It started with small things. A sense that the trees were just a little too quiet. No bird sounds, no movement. The air felt heavier, like a storm was coming, even though the sky was clear. Then I noticed the trail behind me looked different. The brush looked flattened in a few spots, like someone had stepped off the trail and walked through. Could have been me earlier when I was navigating the detour, I told myself. But I wasn't so sure. I kept walking a little faster than before, not running but definitely not strolling. I looked behind me more than once. Nothing there. When I got back to camp, everything was the way I left it. Tent still standing, pack leaning against the tree. Nothing looked disturbed, but I still felt it, that low hum of anxiety in my gut. Like someone had just stepped behind a tree the moment I turned around. I forced myself to calm down, lit the fire, ate dinner. When darkness fell, the fear came back stronger. The woods felt closer that night. I kept turning at every small noise, a snap of twigs, a shuffle of leaves. Each time, I aimed my flashlight, expecting to catch a set of eyes reflecting back. But there was never anything there. I didn't sleep. I lay in the tent with my knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, breathing slow and shallow. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps. Real ones, not animals, not wind, human steps. Soft, careful, deliberate. They circled my tent. I held my breath. They didn't stop. They just moved slowly, one step at a time, all the way around me. Then silence. I don't remember what happened after that. I think I passed out from fear or just lay there too afraid to move. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent slowly. There were footprints in the soft dirt. Boot prints, full size, adult. They came in from the trees, circled the tent, then disappeared the same way. No note, no sign of who it was, just the prints. I didn't bother packing properly. I shoved everything into my pack, didn't eat, didn't even check if I left anything behind. I just wanted to leave. The hike out felt like a dream. I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't stop once. When I reached my car, there was something on the windshield, a small folded piece of notebook paper held in place by a rock. I opened it. It was blank. No message, no writing, just a folded piece of paper. That was it. I never reported it. What would I even say? No one touched me. Nothing was taken. No crime. But I never went back. And I haven't camped alone since. The weirdest part is that I still think about that story from the book. The one I used to love as a kid. I can't remember the name of it. Can't remember the author or what the book looked like. Just that one story. Just that feeling. And now it doesn't feel like a story anymore. It feels like a warning I didn't take seriously. I never planned on going back to that place. The only reason I ended up out there again was because of Rachel. She had always wanted to see the North Cascades, and we were finally in the same part of the country at the same time. We picked a weekend in September, thinking we'd beat the early snow but still get that cool air and fall colors. We weren't new to hiking or camping. I'd grown up in Washington, and she'd done plenty of backcountry stuff during college. So when we planned to do a 2-night trip into a lesser-known stretch of forest near Mount Chavel, we didn't think twice. The area had no official name on most maps, just a loose network of abandoned logging roads and barely marked trails. The kind of place that doesn't get many people anymore. I remembered being there once with my dad years ago. We'd bushwhacked through brush and followed a stream until we found a spot flat enough to sleep. I couldn't even remember exactly where it was, just the feeling I'd had while we were there. Something about the way the trees leaned in over the trail, like they were listening. We drove out from Everett early Friday. Clear skies, cold breeze. It took about 4 hours to reach the turnout off the forest road. From there, we hiked 6 miles in mostly uphill. No one else around. The trail wasn't really a trail after mile 3. It narrowed, became less obvious, just packed dirt and a thin line through the trees. We reached a plateau around mid-afternoon and found a flat spot near a rock outcrop that gave us a view of the ridges below. Pine all around. No signs of people. Just forest stretching in all directions. We set up camp and boiled water for food. I was tired, but in a good way. Rachel had that calm look on her face she got when she was far from cell service. That first night was cold. We heard the usual sounds. Wind in the trees, branches shifting, maybe a raccoon digging through the brush. Normal stuff. I didn't sleep that well, but I figured it was just the elevation and the hard ground. The next morning we explored a bit. There was a faint game trail leading further west, so we followed it just to see where it went. After about 40 minutes of weaving through ferns and stepping over fallen trees, we reached a small clearing. The kind of place that looks like it shouldn't be there. No visible trail in or out, just a circle of short grass, broken sticks, and silence. That silence bothered me. No birds, no breeze, just a weird stillness. There was something in the middle of the clearing, half buried under pine needles and moss. I thought it was a tarp at first, some old camping gear maybe, but when we got closer, it looked more like fabric. A jacket or shirt, torn, faded. I didn't want to touch it, but Rachel did. She pulled up a corner and saw something beneath it. Not a body, just bones. A few long ones. Probably an animal, I told myself. But it looked too clean, too straight. She put the fabric back and stood up without saying anything. We left. The rest of the day, we barely talked. We both acted like nothing had happened, but I knew she felt it too. Something was off. That night, it was colder. The air didn't move. When I stepped away from the tent to relieve myself, I kept looking back over my shoulder. I didn't see anything, but I had that feeling, like something was right behind me. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly, not from a noise, just a jolt, like someone had kicked my tent. I sat up and waited. Nothing. The woods were dead silent. I unzipped the flap and poked my head out. The fire had burned out to just glowing coals. The trees looked darker than before, like the sky had closed in. Then I saw something. Rachel was outside her tent, about 10 feet away, standing up. I was confused at first. She didn't usually sleepwalk or anything like that, but she was standing so still, too still. Her arms were tight to her sides, head tilted slightly. I didn't move. I just watched. Then I noticed something else. Her hands weren't at her sides. They were up, near her neck, holding it. Both hands, just holding. It looked like she was trying to keep her head from moving, like she was bracing it. She didn't move for maybe a minute, just stood there with her hands at her throat. Then she turned and slowly walked back toward her tent. I ducked back inside mine and pretended to sleep. The next morning, she didn't mention it. She looked tired, pale. I didn't say anything either. I couldn't explain what I saw. We broke camp and started the hike back. We were both quiet the first couple miles. It was somewhere around mile 3 when Rachel stopped. She had been in front of me, and she just froze. I stepped up next to her and saw what she was looking at. It was another clearing, but this one wasn't natural. Someone had cut into the slope. Not with machines, this looked older, hand-carved almost. A deep, narrow gash in the ground with edges smoothed by time. Just wide enough for a person to lie down in. At the far end, tucked under some rocks, was another shape. Human-shaped, covered in old clothes, head turned sharply to the side. We didn't go closer. Rachel was shaking. We left that trail and bushwhacked the rest of the way down. I didn't care if we got lost. I just needed to get out of there. We made it back to the car before sunset. We didn't talk on the drive home. That night I didn't sleep. I kept seeing her hands. The way she had clutched her throat like she was holding something in. The next morning I called her, but she didn't answer. I tried again that afternoon. Still nothing. I never heard from Rachel again. Her apartment was cleared out within a month. No missing persons report. Her number was disconnected. Her social media wiped. It was like she'd never existed. I even asked a mutual friend if they'd seen her. They said Rachel had moved away. That's all they knew. I kept thinking about that clearing. The second one. That carved trench. The way she'd been holding her head like it was about to fall off. I don't know what happened to her. I don't think I want to. I've had time to process it. Time to tell myself it was just stress, or altitude, or a bad dream. But I know what I saw, and I haven't camped since. Because now, every time I close my eyes, I picture someone standing in the dark, clutching their neck like they're keeping their head on. And I can't stop wondering what happens if they let go.